Okay everyone, welcome back to part 5 of my Field of Glory 2 Beginner's Guide. And we're going to finish up our discussion of POA differentials, starting with where we left off, so pikes, and moving forward to cover the rest of the units involved. We last left off with Spearman, so we're going to be talking about pikes this time. I've already touched on it in the last video when we talked about the impact foot versus pike situation, with the fact that while pikes are very powerful with two separate keywords that grant 100 POA, the second POA is very restrictive in that on impact the pikes have to be on open terrain to gain that. And they can't be disrupted or disordered. So that's just the first level of cohesion or terrain penalty, the first degree of that penalty to rob them of that 100 POA advantage. So that's something to keep in mind. While they're very powerful, they need to be in open terrain, because anything other than open terrain will cause them to be disrupted or disordered. I think there are some corner cases where a terrain tile is not considered open, but is not considered a rough ground either, and that I think is maybe a minor stream or something. In melee, the deep pike bonus is pretty much the same, except that open terrain is not a requirement anymore. So in those cases, once in melee combat, you're going to have the ability to have a 200 POA even in small streams, which don't count as rough terrain. The other factory issue we talked about was the fact that the deep pike bonus, even though it's not listed in here and on the tooltip, it is not a permanent fixture at 100 POA. This deep pike bonus declines with casualties, and it's basically this keyword exists only as long as the back row or up to 1/4 of the unit is still present. So once a unit drops down to 75% of its authorized strength, the deep pike keyword no longer applies anymore. It's just 0, and you just have the basic pike keyword, which essentially is an offensive spear keyword. It functions pretty much the same. In addition to that, casualties going from that 4th rank, they slowly decrease the bonus from 100 all the way down to 0 in a linear fashion. So say you took 5% casualties, so that's 1/5 of the 25%, 1/5 of 25% where deep pikes would still apply, and you would your deep pike bonus at that point would only be plus 80 POA. Still a very strong POA, no doubt, but bear in mind that as pikes take casualties, this deep pike bonus slowly gets eroded. It actually can get eroded fairly quickly, especially if you're under mass missile fire, things like bowman units, horse archer units, artillery, because they count as pikes. If you take a look, they count as large artillery targets, so they'll take extra damage. Even a bunch of skirmishers, javelin skirmishers, tossing javelins for several turns can seriously erode that bonus. And so that could mess up your math, your internal gut feeling in terms of how these units behave. So far, I have talked about with impact foot and spearmans with regards to pikes. I've treated them, sort of giving you the POA breakdowns, assuming the pikes were at full strength, and I'll continue to do that. But just be aware, pikes are extra sensitive to casualties. So like we talked about combat strength modifiers before in a couple of videos ago about how a unit losing combat strength would suffer penalties. The pikes are more resistant to combat strength penalties simply because there's just so many guys in a pike unit, and that combat strength unit modifier only looks at the first 480 men, I believe. but its deep pike bonus is subject to depletion. So be aware, especially once a unit has taken a lot of casualties, like a pike unit has taken a lot of casualties. If you look at a unit, it's only got two pike guys left in there. It's not going to have that 200 POA bonus against a bunch of stuff. A plus 150 POA still really strong, and as we discussed before, it still beats a whole pile of stuff. But in particular with impact foot, if you lose some of that deep pike bonus on impact, the impact foot could potentially win, have a positive POA modifier on impact, potentially win. And if your pikes then subsequently lose combat and then suffer cohesion failure and drop down to disrupted, that's really bad, because you lose your deep pike bonus, you're disrupted. Now the swordsmen are chopping you up, chopping your pike unit up, and pikes are very much a premium unit in terms of point cost. So if at all possible, try to screen them with your own skirmishers. Minimize their exposure to missile fire, especially. And once the pike units have taken a lot of damage, start treating them more like spearmen. In terms of matchups that we haven't really covered between pikes, so we've already gone over, obviously, impact foot and spearmen versus pikes in the previous video when we discussed those two keywords. Pikes versus light spears. Most light spear units also come with the swordsman capability. We know swordsman capabilities really well from our discussion of impact foot. The problem in discussing these two, the relationship between these units, is that all pikes are heavy foot units and all light spears are medium units, medium foot units, meaning that they will rarely meet in combat on a one-on-one basis, simply because light spear units, they tend to exist in the rough terrain, and pike units, being heavy foot and their deep pike keyword relying on open terrain, or at the very least not being disrupted by terrain effects, you'll find that these two do not meet very often. I would never advise pikes to go into rough terrain to chase after light spears, simply because the disruption effect will rob you of deep pikes, and light spears, that means you'll be fighting light spears on equal footing, except that you will also have a disorder bonus while they will not. The one exception is the irregular foot, who simply do not have a melee keyword to speak of. So pikes can actually go in and beat up irregular foot, but against the rest of the light spear and the heavy weapon lineup of units, in the open, a big advantage is plus 100 POA, impact and melee. But like I said, it's rare that you're going to come across. You're going to get a matchup as favorable as that. Your opponent will tend not to let you get that kind of a favorable matchup. Same thing for bows. While some bows do have like a 50% light spear and swordsman capability, you're not going to find hand-to-hand combat occurring very often against bows. In terms of the discussion we're having, like one-on-one POA differentials. Just for completeness, bows simply have no POAs on impact or melee. The exceptions being the Persians with their Sparabara foot and Immortals, which all have a 50% swordsman capability in melee. Even though it says 50% light spear is actually a will be granted full value. So on impact, if they're in the open, it will be a 100 POA differential on impact, and then on on melee, the pikes will enjoy 200 POA bonus in melee. There are some mounted archer units, mounted bow units, which will have a swordsman keyword, but we'll cover that once we talk about light spear cavalry. Light spear cavalry versus pikes, not really a matchup you'll find often again, simply because of the POA disparity, but it is 150 POA in favor of the pikes on impact. and then it's 200 POA for the pikes, assuming the pikes are not disrupted or disordered. That's because light spear cavalry, both the light spear and the swordsman keyword found on mounted units is actually a different version of the light spear and swordsman unit found on foot units. They don't make it very clear, but as you can see right here, a light spear is only a 50 POA, and that's where you get the 150 POA differential. The swordsman, once again, foot swordsmen get 100 POA versus pikes at all times, but in melee for mounted units, they get 0 POA against steady pikes in this case. So in melee on a head-up one-to-one matchup, it's a very bad matchup for the light spear cavalry. But as I said before, these units tend to evade, and even if they are forced into combat, if they lose, they typically will do a fallback and break contact. With respect to lancers, pikes versus lancers are one of the few infantry units that you could consider attacking lancers with, as in charging them. That's because while the pike bonus is negated, you still retain the deep pike as long as you're in open terrain and charging enemy lancer cavalry. So in terms of POA differentials, it's going to be a wash, a zero POA differential if the pikes are charging lancer cavalry. However, lancer cavalry themselves cannot charge pikes profitably, since the lancer bonus is negated by steady and non-disrupted or non-disordered pikes. So pikes are a good tool in terms of engaging enemy lancer cavalry. You're going to be at a wash in terms of unit capability POAs on impact, and then once melee occurs, lancer cavalry typically are down 100 POA. Elephants are a special case versus pikes. Elephants can be dangerous because they have 250 POA against pretty much anything, and like impact foot, they cause people to check for cohesion tests at a -1 modifier, and that's potentially very dangerous for pike units. The difference, say an elephant versus a regular pike phalanx unit without any other modifiers, that's going to be a 50 POA bonus for elephants. It's not a huge. It's the 30% chance to win. But if the elephants do manage to crack the pikes on impact, it could get hairy, because obviously pikes, once again, 100 POA in melee. Elephants with plus 100 POA versus melee, and disrupted pikes will not receive their deep pike bonus to help them out against the elephants. That said, there is a large combat strength modifier in favor of the pikes versus the elephants to help even it up. But in general, you shouldn't. It's not something you should be overly concerned about, but just be aware elephants charging pikes. If you get unlucky, that's when those sort of chain cascades happen. So if at all possible, make sure you have some backup available, just in case. In terms of chariots, very much similar to what we talked about earlier with lancer cavalry, heavy chariots are considered shock troops, mounted shock troops. And with that goes the same caveat. You can't really charge them unless it's a flank charge. They can't really charge you either. So it's one of those standoff situations where neither should really be going after the other. But in terms of them charging you, they're in your world, so you shouldn't be too worried about chariots in front of your pike line, other than the fact that chariots tend to be cheaper than your average pike unit. So it might be a points disparity situation where they're using a cheaper number of points to tie up a more expensive unit. Scud chariots, not something you'll see too often, but long as you're not disordered. Once again, this massive 250 POA bonus just doesn't apply, so it's nothing to be too worried about. Okay, moving on to light spear units. Light spear units are usually carry the swordsman, the foot swordsman keyword, with the exception of a regular foot. It's not a light spear is not a particularly glamorous keyword. It's a very mediocre 100 POA on impact. At which point the units will switch over to swordsman if they do have that keyword. Like I said, it's only irregular foot that comes without any POA bonus on melee. In terms of light spear versus these units, we've already covered that, the impact foot, spearmen, and pikes. With respect to bows, since they don't get any impact or melee POA bonuses, light spears will have 100 POA versus bows, both on impact and melee. The exception being Persian archer units, such as the Immortals, which get a 50% spear bonus and 50% swordsman bonus. In practical terms, against Persians, light spear units are actually an even have a 0 differential on POAs because for whatever reason, impact doesn't care about being 50% light spear. You get the full, the Persians will get 100 POA, the full light spear bonus that light spear units get. But the 50% swordsman does mean that the melee side is halved. So instead of 100 POA versus 100 POA, it's going to be 100 POA versus 50 POA in terms of light spear versus Persian bows. All right, moving on to light spear versus light spear infantry versus light spear cavalry. The skinny is that the light spear infantry will have a 50 POA advantage on light spear cavalry on impact, and a 0 POA differential in melee. For Lancer cavalry, it's going to be 0 POA differentials if we're looking at keywords alone. Unfortunately, this type of comparison starts to break down around this point because a large number of light spear cavalry units, you will find most lists will have light spear cavalry or most cavalry in general to be of superior quality with armor bonus. There are some exceptions. Simply put, on the cavalry end, there's a large amount of variation in terms of armor and quality. So the conversation we've been having with respect to POAs based on keywords alone is less useful than it was previously when we looked at infantrymen versus infantrymen amongst themselves and against cavalry. So I've already mentioned this before. We're only looking at unit capability differentials in POA. You always have to factor in whether the opposing units have better quality in terms of unit quality, whether they're superior versus say average, and whether they've got better armor than your unit or not, or whether you have an armor advantage. Those are things you have to take into consideration. And like I said, this is where the relationship breaks down a bit. Light spears, if you were to look at keywords alone, they look like they're pretty decent against cavalry. But just be aware, a large number of cavalry being fielded by most armies will either be superior or armored or both. You will find some lesser cavalry units such as Roman cavalry that are average, but they're still armored. It's only really against Indian cavalry, which don't have a melee keyword at all, where the light spears, the relationship would be more useful in terms of discussing on unit capabilities alone. Lancers, obviously, I actually think all Lancers are superior. I cannot think of a Lancer unit that is not superior, and almost all are armored. with the exception of just your generic Noble Lancer, which is only protected. So be very aware of that. Light spears, even though the unit capabilities don't seem to indicate to you that they would be a big underdog versus mounted troops, typically they are simply on the basis of less armor and lower troop quality. For light spear versus elephants, in the open, it's a big no-no. It's simply too dangerous to try to engage elephants in the open, either receiving a charge or charging elephants. The elephants have a massive 250 POA bonus, and light spears is in general not going to cut it. It's just like how spearmen don't really do well against elephants, because it's just so dangerous to try to even get in contact with them. The penalty is so massive, and elephants force enemy units who lose combat against them to test at a -1 penalty on their cohesion roll. So something to be avoided, especially in the open. In rough terrain, elephants are actually severely disordered in rough terrain, so light spears, naturally being at home in rough terrain, would do very well against elephants. For light spears versus chariots, there's just too much variation for us to really get a general rule. The only general rule I can really offer is that heavy chariots typically will beat light spears in the open, and obviously chariots will almost never go into rough terrain. So it's one of those situations where it's if you're in the open and you're a light spear unit, you definitely want to avoid the chariots in the open, or at least not place them in a position where they can be charged. The POA penalties, the differentials, go anywhere from just theoretically even on unit capabilities alone, if you're dealing with Indian chariots, to a negative 50 POA differential against heavy chariots, or a 150 POA differential against scythed chariots. So they run the gamut. Depending on the type of chariot, you may or may not be willing to risk being out in the open, but just bear in mind, heavy chariots are all superior. While scythed chariots are not superior quality, they obviously have the massive POA bonus at 250 POA. For light chariots, you can really consider them more like a light spear cavalry with that in terms of that respect. They are superior, though. Once again, most mounted troops end up being superior quality units. For the discussion of bows, the only thing I'm really going to talk about is that in terms of bows, there's really not too much to talk about, in that they get, almost all bow units get 0 POA bonuses for impact or melee. There are a few units that do gain some sort of bonuses, namely the Persians, which get a 50% light spear and 50% swordsman bonus. But typically that's not enough to really justify using them in terms of a close combat role. Their main value obviously is in shooting. The thing to note is that they do count as non-light troops, so anything that infantry would normally disrupt on combat, or mounted troops would disrupt in terms of cohesion loss, like say a flank charge, those would still apply. So even though they do not carry any inherent melee bonuses, it doesn't mean that they're totally worthless. You can still get off flank charges and cause disruptions to cohesion that way. However, given the fact that they have 0 POA on impact or melee, you shouldn't really worry about dealing with them in close combat. I've even sent in heavy infantry units, heavy foot units into the rough to take them out, simply because the disruption, the fact that they have 0 POA, means that even if a unit is disrupted, on rough ground, it's not enough to stop them from being beaten quite decisively in close combat. There are some exceptions. Persians, with the introduction of Immortals, the Immortal Fire DLC, they are a special type of bow unit that carry 50% spear and 50% swordsman. Light spear at 50% is actually functionally 100%. For whatever reason, on impact combat, they don't care about the 50% light spear rule. Persian Barabara Foot and Immortals will get the full 100 POA out of the light spear keyword. So you can apply that with what we've already talked about with light spear swordsman unit. They also get 50% swordsman keyword. That 50% does kick in, so it will be 50%. Your bonuses will be exactly half of what regular swordsman would get. So 100 against any foot becomes 50, 100 against any foot or cavalry becomes 50 POA, and the 50 POA versus steady spearman drops down to 25 POA. So the Persians will put up slightly more resistance. You might want to think twice in terms of sending heavy foot into rough to go after Persian bowmen, simply because given the fact they do have some keyword, some fighting power, they will hold out much longer than regular bows, which simply do not have any keywords. They also have their arm protected as well, so they'll lose out on armor. The final topic to be discussed will be the mounted troops, cavalry of all kinds, the chariots, and as well as elephants. As I mentioned before when discussing light spears, cavalry tends to vary in terms of unit quality and unit armor. So in terms of discussing light spear versus lancer cavalry, there's not that much to discuss, other than that they're essentially identical units, with the exception of lancer cavalry being mounted shock troops, and the implications for infantry trying to charge these units that come into effect, and the fact that if light spear cavalry fights lancer cavalry on impact, they'll be at a minor disadvantage of 50 POA. The more important factors that determine winners and losers would be the unit quality, as well as unit armor. Although in general, Lancer cavalry tends to be, I think all Lancer cavalry is considered superior quality, come with superior quality, and almost all of them are armored with the exception of noble Lancers. Whereas light spear cavalry, they come in a lot more flavors. You have the really good, the high quality ones such as Iranian cavalry, with being superior and armored. Iranian armored cavalry, and you have some less quality ones such as Indian cavalry, which has below average quality and is only protected, and also does not get a mounted swordsman keyword. Cavalry in general does not do well against elephants. Not only are elephants are they a 150 POA underdog on impact, but elephants also cause disorder against horse-mounted units. So that the practical effect, we'll just pull that up real quick. Troop type elephants disorders mounted troops on adjacent square. That means that any cavalry unit adjacent to an elephant will suffer a 22% penalty to its POA in combat, whether it's fighting the elephant or not. If that elephant that's disrupting them is friendly, the penalty is halved to 11%. You can refer to the second video, actually it's a third video, if you want to take a look at how disruption penalties affect percentages in combat. But it's just fairly obvious, I think, from this point, not only are they suffering from a 150 POA penalty on impact, but also from disruption, that cavalry in general should be kept away from elephants, and that goes for chariots as well. Chariots, there's not much to discuss other than, once again, there's a large variety, large disparity between chariots and what they do. So it's less about keywords in terms of unit capabilities and more about their quality. Scythe Chariots is important to note as a difference maker in that they have plus 250 against almost everything except for Lancers. One of the few cases where Lancers are a bit better than Light Spear Cavalry in that the Scythe Chariots, they don't get this massive 250 POA bonus versus Lancers on impact. Okay, and that'll do it for part 5 of our Field of Glory 2 Beginner's Guide. Hopefully, if you watched all the videos up to this point, you will have all the tools you need to take a look at the map once both sides have deployed and be able to forecast with some degree of accuracy the flow of battle and likely outcomes along various sectors of your line. You should be able to look at simply unit types and unit capabilities and determine where your own line is strong and where your own line is weak, and maybe start to send help before the crisis actually develops so that you can meet it in a timely manner. Part 6 of the video will go over the last major topic yet to be discussed, and that's going to be unit quality with respect to cohesion tests, and that's going to be coming up in part 6. Thanks for watching.